The Montana sun was a hammer, and Maybelle Quinn was the anvil. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything, blurring the world into a hazy nightmare. Her horse, little more than a bag of bones, stumbled beneath her, a perfect mirror of her own soul. 2 days, 2 days she'd been running, fleeing a life that had wrapped its hands around her throat. And now this ranch. Jed Cartwright's ranch. A name she'd heard whispered in a dusty saloon. A place so remote, so isolated, it felt like the edge of the world. It was her last hope. Anonymity was the only prayer she had left. She pulled the tired mare to a stop before a weathered porch that looked like it had been in a fistfight with the wind and lost. The log house behind it stood silent, watchful, like a predator. As she slid from the saddle, every muscle screaming in protest, a shadow detached itself from the porch. He was tall, broad, a man carved from mountain granite. His eyes were like chips of flint, hard and cold. Jed Cartwright. His hands, calloused and thick, rested on his hips. He wasn't a rancher. He was a warden guarding a tomb. "You lost, ma'am." His voice was a low rumble, laced with a suspicion that cut deeper than any knife. Maybelle met his gaze, forcing a strength she didn't have. Her own voice, hoarse from dust and disuse, held a spark of defiance. "Hardly. I heard you needed help. I'm Maybelle Quinn. I'm looking for work." She let her eyes drift over the broken corrals, the untended fields, the general air of decay. "Looks like you could use a lot of it." Jed's gaze narrowed. It was a physical thing, an inspection that picked her apart. He saw the travel-stained dress, too fine for a drifter. He saw the softness in her hands, the terror she was trying so hard to hide behind her pride. He saw a woman who didn't belong. "Work?" he scoffed. "What kind of work you reckon you can do out here, Miss Quinn?" The question was an accusation. She didn't flinch. "Any kind," she shot back, the bravado practiced, a shield she'd carried for years. "I can cook, clean, mend." Then came the gamble, the lie that would change everything. "I can even milk a cow." She knew how to tame silences, how to navigate the treacherous currents of a dangerous man's temper. She'd never touched a cow in her life. A shadow of a smile, one that never reached his eyes, touched Jed's lips. He didn't believe her. Not for a second. But something flickered in his face. Desperation, maybe. Or just plain curiosity. He grunted, jerking his chin toward a sprawling barn. "Got a barn. You can sleep there. We'll see about the rest." He turned and vanished back into the house, leaving her alone in the dust, the offer hanging in the air like a noose. The barn was sparse but surprisingly clean. The scent of hay and horses was a strange comfort. Maybelle dragged her saddle inside and collapsed onto a pile of hay, the darkness taking her instantly. She woke before dawn, a deep-seated instinct for survival pushing her from the hay. Moving through the silent house like a ghost, she found Jed's meager pantry. By the time the sun cracked the horizon, the smell of brewing coffee and frying bacon filled the air. Jed emerged from his room and stopped dead. A full breakfast was laid out on the rough-hewn table. He ate in silence, his flinty eyes watching her every move, trying to piece together the puzzle she presented. Maybelle ignored him, clearing the table with a quiet competence that seemed at odds with the woman he thought he saw. In the days that followed, she was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency. Dust vanished, surfaces gleamed. The musty smell of neglect was replaced by the clean scent of pine. She mended his torn shirts with impossibly neat stitches, organized the chaos of his desk, and even coaxed a dying rose bush by the window back to life. Jed watched from a distance, his skepticism slowly, grudgingly, turning to respect. He spoke little, but his eyes were always on her, a silent question hanging between them. This woman, this Maybelle Quinn, was starting to chip away at the fortress he'd built around his heart since Laura died 2 years ago. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. But the lie about the cow was still there, a ticking clock waiting to explode. One sweltering afternoon, it happened. Jed came out of the barn, a pail clanging against his leg. His eyes found her where she was hanging laundry, the clean white sheets a stark contrast to the dusty yard. "Got a cow needs milking," he announced, his voice flat, emotionless. "Buttercup, she's due." Maybelle's stomach twisted into a knot of pure ice. She forced a nod, tried to look unfazed. Right. Buttercup. Her mind was a frantic scramble as she followed him to the milking shed. She'd seen cows in pictures from the distant window of a train. Never up close. Never like this. Buttercup was a mountain of placid flesh, but to Maybelle she looked like a four-legged monster guarding the gates of hell. Jed gestured to a small wooden stool. "Go on." He leaned against the stall door, arms crossed, and she saw it. A flicker of dark amusement in his eyes. He knew. He'd known all along. This wasn't a chore. It was a test. She approached the cow, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took the pail and stool, her hands trembling. Kneeling in the dirt, her fingers hovered over the udder, completely lost. The cow shifted, a simple, lazy movement, and Maybelle flinched back as if she'd been struck. She tried to remember pictures she'd seen, tried to mimic the motion. A squeeze, a pull, nothing. Her hands were too soft, too unsure. She tugged, she squeezed harder. Buttercup just twitched her tail, mildly annoyed. Then she heard it. A low chuckle, rough as gravel, from the doorway. "Figured as much," Jed drawled, the words dripping with a satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "You lied, Miss Quinn." Her face burned with shame, with anger. "It's not my fault. No one ever taught me how to wrestle a beast the size of a carriage." He pushed off the door frame, and the small shed suddenly felt suffocatingly small. He moved toward her, and the air crackled, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with her lie. He knelt beside her, his large frame dwarfing hers, the heat of his body a palpable thing. "It ain't about wrestling, Maybelle." His voice was closer now, a low thrum against her skin. "It's about knowing." He reached out. His calloused fingers didn't just touch hers, they enveloped them. He guided her hand, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Watch." With a smooth, rhythmic motion he showed her, and a stream of warm milk hissed into the pail. She watched, mesmerized, not by the milking, but by him. The scent of leather and earth, the sheer size of him, the unexpected gentleness in his hands. "Now you try," he said, his voice gruff, but the harsh edge was gone. He didn't move away. His arm brushed against hers, a warm, solid weight that sent a jolt through her entire body. Acutely aware of his closeness, the way his breath stirred the hair at her temple, she tried again. Her hands still felt clumsy, foreign. "It's not as easy as you make it look, Rancher," she snapped, her usual sarcasm a desperate shield against the storm brewing inside her. He chuckled again, a deep sound that seemed to loosen something tight in her chest. "Nothing worthwhile ever is." His hand closed over hers again, guiding her, teaching her. The sensation was electric, a raw, unexpected heat that made her breath catch in her throat. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, and a shiver traced its way down her spine. The milk streamed into the pail. "See," he murmured, his voice deeper now, almost a growl. "Just needs the right touch." His eyes, those flinty, guarded eyes, held a new light. It wasn't just instruction anymore. It was something else, something raw and dangerous. She pulled her hand away, feigning an irritation she didn't feel, her nerves screaming. "Well, perhaps I'm more suited to taming silent houses than silent cows." Jed rose, his shadow falling over her. He watched her for a long moment, and she could feel the weight of his gaze, the reassessment happening behind his eyes. He saw more than a liar now. He saw the fear she'd arrived with, the desperation behind the lie. But he also saw the fire, the tenacity that refused to be extinguished. And in her sarcasm, her sharp edges, he recognized something of himself. A person who used wit as armor to hide a gaping wound. He knew that wound. It was the same one that festered in his own soul. He turned and walked out, leaving her with the cow, the half-full pail of milk, and a connection so powerful, so unexpected, it left her breathless. The ranch, once a tomb, was starting to feel alive, and she was terrified. Twilight bled across the Montana sky, painting it in shades of bruised purple and dying orange. The world surrendered to a moonless night, and the crickets began their ceaseless, lonely song. Maybelle couldn't settle. The encounter in the milking shed had left her raw, exposed. She stepped out onto the porch of the small cabin Jed had given her, needing the cool night air to clear her head. And that's when she saw him, a hunched silhouette on the edge of the main house porch, his back to her. He was unnervingly still. Then a sound reached her, a soft, ragged noise carried on the breeze. A sob, deep and broken. It was followed by another, and then she saw the unmistakable tremor of his shoulders, shaking with a grief so profound it stole the air from her lungs. This man, this mountain of a man who carried himself like an unbreakable fortress, was shattered. A wave of empathy so powerful it almost buckled her knees, washed over her. Her first instinct was to flee, to give him the dignity of his private pain. But something held her there. It was a recognition. She knew that kind of desolate loneliness. She knew what it was to be utterly alone with your ghosts. Slowly, silently, she moved. Her boots made no sound on the worn wooden planks. She didn't speak. She simply lowered herself onto the top step, a respectful distance away, yet close enough to hear the quiet rasp of his breathing. The silence that fell between them wasn't empty. It was thick with unspoken sorrow, with the crushing weight of years of pain. His sobs slowly subsided, replaced by the occasional shuddering breath. He didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her presence, but she felt a subtle shift in the air, a slight easing of the rigid tension that always defined him. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, he stirred. He turned his head just enough for her to see the wet tracks glistening on his weathered cheeks in the faint starlight. His eyes, usually so guarded, were just pools of shadow and sorrow. He looked at her, a long, searching look. She saw the pain, but also a flicker of surprise, followed by a hesitant, reluctant acceptance. No words were needed. Her silent presence was an offering of solace, and in his quiet gaze he accepted it. A deep, ragged sigh escaped him. "Laura," he rasped, his voice raw, the name a fragile ghost in the night air. He cleared his throat, a sound like shifting gravel. "It's been 2 years, 2 years since the yellow fever took her." His gaze drifted to the dark outline of the house, a mausoleum of memories. This ranch, it was our dream. After she, after she was gone, it became my prison. Every corner, every shadow. It's her. His voice cracked and he squeezed his eyes shut, fighting a fresh wave of grief. "I can't shake it. It's like I'm drowning." He opened his eyes and they were filled with a desperate plea. "That's why I hired you, Maybelle. I needed someone to break the silence, to keep me from going under completely." He had laid his soul bare. A man stripped of all his defenses, showing her the raw, bleeding wound he carried. Now it was her turn. She took a deep breath, the cool night air a balm to her own frayed nerves. "I didn't come here to milk cows, Jed." Her voice was soft, but it cut through the night with the clarity of a bell. His brow furrowed in confusion. "That was a lie," she continued, the words tasting like ash. "A necessary one." She gathered her courage, the weight of her own past pressing down, threatening to suffocate her. "My name is Maybelle Quinn. I came from Kansas. I was supposed to marry a man there. Silas." A shiver she couldn't control ran through her. He was a prosperous rancher, charming. But underneath there was a darkness, a possessiveness that turned ugly. She forced herself to meet Jed's gaze, to offer him the same raw honesty he had given her. One night he'd been drinking. He made it very clear what my life with him would be. A cage. Her voice tightened, but she pushed on. I knew I had to run. I packed what I could, stole a horse, and rode. I didn't care where, just as far west as I could get. I needed a place where no one would ever find me, a place where I could be safe. Her eyes pleaded with him for understanding. This ranch, it felt like the end of the world, the perfect place to hide. Jed listened, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning comprehension, then to a quiet, profound empathy. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a shared understanding of pain, of loss, of the desperate need to survive. He saw the fear that still lingered behind her defiant facade. He saw the ghost she was running from. The air between them, once thick with his sorrow, now hummed with a different energy. It was the energy of a shared secret, a bond forged in the fires of confession. The vast chasm that had separated the reclusive rancher and the mysterious runaway was gone. They looked at each other, really looked, for the first time. The silence was no longer about grief or lies. It was filled with a quiet intensity, a palpable current that flowed between them. It wasn't just understanding anymore. It was attraction, a powerful magnetic pull that had been simmering just beneath the surface. But now, stripped of all pretense, it flared into life, undeniable and real. In the vast, silent darkness of the Montana night, two broken souls found a fragile, unexpected connection, a quiet promise of shelter in each other's shadows. But shadows have a way of bringing monsters to life. The days that followed were a quiet revolution. The desolate ranch began to breathe again. Mornings started with shared coffee on the porch, the silence between them no longer a wall of grief, but a comfortable space of understanding. Jed found himself watching her as she moved through the day, feeding the chickens, mending a torn canvas, her movements filled with a surprising grace. He even found himself smiling, a real smile, as he watched her comical yet determined battles with Buttercup the cow, a battle she was now winning. The heavy weariness that had defined him began to lift, replaced by a light camaraderie, but it was punctuated by moments of intense, unspoken awareness. A brush of hands as they passed a tool, a shared glance across the dusty yard that held for a second too long. In those moments, the air would thicken, charged with a current that left them both breathless. The long dormant ember of desire in Jed's soul began to glow. He was drawn to her spirit, her fire, the deep well of vulnerability she tried so hard to conceal. And she, in turn, found herself captivated by the quiet strength in his hands, the deep sorrow in his eyes she so desperately wanted to soothe, and the unexpected kindness that would break through his gruff exterior like a ray of sun through storm clouds. The ranch was no longer a prison. It was becoming a haven, a shared space where two lonely people were slowly, inevitably, falling for each other. But havens can be invaded, and storms were brewing on the horizon. One evening, as the sky turned a bruised purple, the wind began to howl. It was a mournful, angry sound that swept across the plains. The temperature dropped, and the first fat drops of rain turned to stinging sleet that hammered against the windows. Jed sat by the fire, listening to the storm's fury, his gaze drifting toward the barn. Mabel had insisted on staying there, claiming the hay was warm enough. He knew better. That wind would find every crack, and the damp chill would seep into her bones. A knot of concern, sharp and unfamiliar, tightened in his chest. He couldn't leave her out there. Not in this. With a sigh that carried the weight of his own reluctance and a burgeoning, fierce protectiveness, he stood. He pulled on his heavy coat, tugged his hat low, and stepped out into the tempest. The wind clawed at him, the sleet 1,000 tiny needles against his skin. He leaned into the gale, trudging toward the faint, welcoming glow of the lantern in the barn. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of hay and animals, a world away from the raging storm. Maybelle was curled on a makeshift bed of straw, a worn blanket pulled to her chin, reading by the lantern's dim light. Her eyes, wide and luminous, flickered up as his large silhouette filled the doorway. "Jed, what in tarnation are you doing out here?" she called, her voice a little breathless. "Came to get you," he stated, his voice rough against the wind's roar. "It's a brutal night. You'll freeze. Come to the house. There's a fire." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. He had to say it. He had to be honest. "But you should know," he added, his voice dropping. "There's only one bed." Maybelle's eyes, already bright, seemed to sparkle with a mischievous challenge. She pushed herself up, the blanket falling away to reveal the simple cotton dress she wore. A slow, knowing smile played on her lips, her voice soft but laced with steel. "Only one bed, you say?" She tilted her head, her gaze direct, unwavering. "Well then, Mr. Cartwright, why don't I just sleep with you?" The words hit him like a physical blow. A jolt of pure shock, laced with a terrifying thrill, shot through him. His jaw tightened. He was suddenly painfully aware of the close confines of the barn, the scent of hay, the woman before him, the image of her in his bed, her warmth, her presence. It was a temptation he had fought, a door he had sworn to keep locked forever. "Maybelle," he started, his voice a low growl of warning, aimed more at himself than at her. "I couldn't. I wouldn't be able to sleep with you next to me." The admission was raw, honest, torn from a place deep inside him he kept hidden from the world. His guarded eyes betrayed a flicker of raw, desperate longing. A beat of silence stretched between them, the storm hammering against the walls, a furious primal drumbeat. Maybelle's smile widened. It wasn't just mischievous now, it held a profound understanding. Her eyes, alight with a fierce, unwavering intensity, locked onto his. The air in the barn crackled, charged with an unspoken electricity that was more powerful than the lightning outside. Her voice, when she spoke, was a low, husky whisper that bypassed all his defenses and went straight for his soul. "But Jed," she murmured, her gaze never leaving his, her voice a knowing, sensual challenge. "Who said I want to sleep?" The words were a detonation. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that erupted inside Jed. His breath hitched. The walls he'd spent 2 years building, the fortress of grief and solitude, crumbled to dust under the weight of her gaze. Her question wasn't an invitation. It was a demand, a stripping away of all pretense, all fear. He took a step toward her, then another, drawn by a force he could no longer fight. The space between them vanished. Her eyes fluttered shut for a heartbeat, then opened, holding his, a silent challenge and a deep, unspoken yearning. His large, calloused hand reached out, not for her face, but for the curve of her waist, pulling her flush against him. Her own hand came up to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic, wild beating of his heart. The kiss was a collision, a primal, visceral claiming born of weeks of unspoken longing, of shared grief and suppressed desire. It devoured the air between them, rough and demanding, sending a shockwave through every nerve in her body. She responded with equal fervor, her fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer, deeper. The world outside, the raging storm, the judging town, it all faded away to a distant roar. All that existed was the raw, undeniable truth of their connection. He swept her into his arms, their mouths still locked, and carried her to the soft, yielding mound of hay. The scent of dried grass enveloped them as the thunder cracked overhead, a deep, resonant rumble that echoed the pounding of their hearts. In the heart of the tempest, in the rustic simplicity of the barn, their surrender was absolute. It was a fierce, desperate coming together of two broken souls, finding not just passion, but a profound healing solace in each other's arms. The storm raged on, but inside the barn, a different kind of fire was burning, a quiet, burgeoning warmth that promised a new dawn. The first rays of dawn sliced through the cracks in the barn walls, painting the rough-hewn timbers in gold. Jed woke first, his arm a heavy protective weight across Maybelle's waist. He watched her sleep, the soft rise and fall of her chest, the tangle of her dark hair against the straw. A wave of tenderness, so sharp and unfamiliar it almost hurt, washed over him. It was immediately followed by the familiar, cold stab of guilt. Laura's face, serene and smiling, flickered in his mind. He had sworn this would never happen. This closeness, this vulnerability. Yet here he was, tangled in the warmth of a woman who had, in a few short weeks, melted the ice that had encased his heart. Maybelle stirred, her eyes fluttering open. A silent question passed between them, an acknowledgment of the line they had crossed. A faint blush colored her cheeks, but her gaze held no shame, only a quiet, burgeoning joy. "Morning, rancher," she whispered, her voice husky. "Morning, Maybelle," he replied, his own voice rougher than he intended. They emerged from the barn into the crisp morning air, the world washed clean by the storm. Maybelle's usually perfect braid was slightly undone, Jed's shirt untucked. A few yards away, Zeke Holloway, the lumberjack, was already loading his wagon. He paused, his sharp eyes taking in their disheveled appearance. A slow, knowing grin spread across his face, revealing a missing tooth. He said nothing. He just tipped his hat, a single gesture that spoke volumes. By midday, when Jed drove the wagon into Harmony Creek for supplies with Maybelle beside him, the news had already arrived. It had traveled faster than a prairie fire, fanned by Zeke's gossip. Heads turned, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes followed them, cold and judging. Jed's jaw tightened. He'd lived as a hermit for 2 years, shielded from this. Now, because of him, Maybelle was exposed to their venom. A fierce, protective instinct flared inside him. As they stepped onto the boardwalk in front of the general store, a figure detached itself from a group of women. It was Ruth Dobbins, Laura's oldest friend. Her face was a mask of pinched disapproval, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. "Jed Cartwright," her voice cut through the street like a whip. "Have you no shame? 2 years, 2 years you mourn our sweet Laura, and now you parade this hussy through our town." She gestured wildly at Maybelle, her face contorted in disgust. Laura would be heartbroken. To see her home, her memory, defiled by a harlot. The words were a physical blow to Jed. They struck the raw, unhealed wound of his grief, twisting the knife of his guilt. The weight of his past, of the town's unspoken accusations, settled on his shoulders. His first instinct was to retreat, to pull Maybelle away, to hide. But Maybelle didn't move. She stood her ground, her chin held high, her eyes blazing with a quiet fire that stunned him. "My name is Maybelle Quinn," she stated, her voice clear and steady. "And I work for Mr. Cartwright. What happens on his ranch is his business. And mine. It certainly isn't yours, Mrs. Dobbins." Ruth scoffed. "Work? Is that what you call it? You've barely been here a month, and you've brought nothing but scandal." She turned her full fury back on Jed. "How could you, Jed? After everything Laura was to you, to all of us. You dishonor her memory." Jed felt himself being torn in two. The ghost of Laura, his lost love, pulled him toward the familiar path of guilt and solitude. But Maybelle, standing beside him, unwavering, her courage a bright beacon in the storm of judgment, pulled him towards something new, something worth fighting for. He saw not a harlot, but a woman of incredible strength and resilience. Her refusal to back down was a stark contrast to his own instinct to run. It was a silent challenge. Choose. He looked at Maybelle, at the fire in her eyes, and then he looked at Ruth, at the hate in hers. And he chose. His gaze hardened. "Ruth," he said, his voice low but carrying an authority that silenced the entire street. "You will not speak of Maybelle that way again. She is a good woman, and she has brought light back into a home that has been dark for far too long." He stepped forward, placing a hand on Maybelle's back, a clear, defiant gesture of solidarity. "Laura loved me, and she would want me to find happiness. She would not want me to live as a ghost." His eyes swept over the faces of the townspeople, challenging each and every one of them. "Maybelle Quinn is a part of my life now, and if you have a problem with that, you have a problem with me." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Jed Cartwright, the broken widower, was fighting back. Not for himself, for her. Maybelle looked up at him, her eyes shining with surprise and a gratitude so profound it left her weak. In that moment, a wall hadn't just fallen. It had been obliterated. But by defending her, Jed had just painted a target on both their backs. And a far greater storm was coming. The confrontation in town changed everything. Jed had drawn a line in the sand, and the ranch became their entire world, a fortress against the cold stares and whispers of Harmony Creek. A new purpose settled over the place. The fences were mended, the fields were tended, and the quiet happiness blossoming between them seemed to infuse the very land, making it thrive. The barn, once just a place of chores, became their sanctuary, the hay a silent witness to a passion that deepened into a profound and steady love. For the first time since she fled Kansas, Maybelle felt safe. She allowed herself to believe she had truly escaped. She was wrong. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday. A stranger rode into Harmony Creek. He was handsome, well-dressed, his suit a stark contrast to the dusty denims of the locals. He moved with an easy confidence, a predator's grace, and his smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He started asking questions. Quiet questions at first, in the saloon, at the general store. Questions about a woman, a dark-haired woman who might have passed through a few months back. His name was Silas. The news reached the ranch via Zeke Holloway, who'd taken to stopping by with lumber and gossip. "Fella in town, Jed," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Askin' about a woman sounds a powerful lot like your Maybelle." A cold dread, colder than any Montana winter, seized Jed. He looked at Maybelle, saw the blood drain from her face, saw the old terror flare in her eyes. The ghost she'd been running from had found her. "He can't make me go back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He can't." Jed took her hand, his own grip firm, steady. "He won't," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is your home now." But they both knew it wasn't that simple. Silas wasn't a man who took no for an answer. He was a man who took whatever he wanted. The next day he came to the ranch. He rode up not on a dusty cow pony, but on a sleek black stallion that looked as out of place as he did. He dismounted and strode toward the porch, where Jed and Maybelle stood waiting, a united front. "Maybelle, my dear," Silas said, his voice smooth as silk, yet layered with menace. "You've led me on quite a chase. Did you really think you could hide from me at the edge of the world?" "This is my home, Silas," Maybelle said, her voice shaking but firm. "You're not welcome here." Silas laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Your home? This dilapidated hovel? Don't be foolish. You belong with me. We're to be married." He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on her. Jed moved, placing himself squarely between them. "She's not going anywhere," Jed said, his voice flat and dangerous. Silas finally looked at Jed, his gaze dismissive, contemptuous. "And who is this?" "The simple farmer who thinks he can keep what is mine," he smirked. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, old man." He turned his attention back to Maybelle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Did you tell him, my dear? Did you tell him about your father? About the debts he owed me? Did you tell him that our marriage wasn't a proposal, it was a business transaction? You weren't my betrothed, Maybelle. You were my property." The world tilted. Jed stared at Maybelle, saw the shame and horror in her eyes. It was a secret she had kept buried, a truth too ugly to confess. She wasn't just running from an abusive fiancé. She'd been sold. Silas saw his advantage. He lunged, grabbing Maybelle's arm. "You're coming with me, now!" Maybelle cried out, a sound of pure terror. Something inside Jed snapped. The quiet, grieving rancher disappeared. In his place was a man pushed too far, a man defending his world. He moved with a speed that belied his size, his fist connecting with Silas's jaw in a sickening crack. Silas stumbled back, shock and fury on his face. He reached inside his fine coat, his hand emerging with a small, silver-plated derringer. He aimed it directly at Jed's heart. "You'll regret that," Silas snarled. But before he could fire, a blur of motion came from the porch. Maybelle, her face a mask of cold fury, swung a heavy iron skillet with all her might. The pan connected with Silas's wrist. The gun clattered to the ground. Silas howled in pain, clutching his broken arm. "You'll pay for this," he seethed, his eyes filled with venom. "Both of you." Jed didn't hesitate. He scooped up the fallen derringer and leveled it at Silas's chest. "Get on your horse," he ordered, his voice deadly calm. "And you ride out of this territory. If I ever see your face again, I will put a bullet between your eyes. Now get." Scrambling, cradling his broken arm, Silas mounted his horse and galloped away, a trail of dust and curses in his wake. The silence he left behind was deafening. Maybelle stood trembling, the heavy skillet still in her hand. Jed turned to her, his face grim. The secrets were out. The violence she had fled had found them. He looked from her terrified face to the endless horizon where Silas had disappeared. This wasn't over. A man like Silas didn't just give up. He escalated. And when he came back, he wouldn't be coming alone. He'd be coming for blood. The dust from Silas's retreat had barely settled when the second wave hit. A week later, two men, their faces hard and their guns worn, rode into town. They didn't work for Silas. They worked for the law. They carried a warrant, signed by a judge back in Kansas, for the arrest of one Maybelle Quinn. The charge was theft, a horse and a significant sum of money, money her father had supposedly embezzled before his convenient death, money that, according to the warrant, had paid off his debts to Silas. It was a lie, a beautifully crafted, legally binding lie. Silas hadn't just come for revenge. He'd come for ruin. He was using the law to paint Maybelle as a common criminal, a thief on the run. The town, already primed to believe the worst of her, ate it up. Ruth Dobbins and her circle saw it as divine justice, proof that their initial judgment had been correct. Maybelle wasn't just a harlot, she was a felon. The sheriff, a man named Eli, rode out to the ranch, the two bounty hunters flanking him like vultures. He was a decent man, but the law was the law. "Jed, I'm sorry," he said, his face etched with regret. "I have a warrant. I have to take her in." Jed stood on the porch, a rifle held loosely in his hands. Maybelle was behind him, her face pale but her eyes defiant. "You know this is a lie, Eli," Jed said, his voice low and steady. "It's that snake Silas pulling the strings." "Maybe so," the sheriff conceded, "but the paper is real. I gotta do my job." Don't make this harder than it has to be. One of the bounty hunters, a man with a greasy beard and cruel eyes, smirked. Just hand over the girl, farmer. We'll see she gets a fair trial before she hangs. The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Maybelle stepped forward. I'll go, she said, her voice surprisingly strong. But you're a fool, Sheriff, if you think this is about justice. Jed watched them lead her away, his heart a cold, hard knot in his chest. He felt a helplessness he hadn't known since he'd watched Laura slip away. But this was different. This wasn't a fever he couldn't fight. This was a man, and a man could be broken. He didn't sleep. He spent the night in the barn, the scent of hay and Maybelle a constant, aching reminder. He thought about Silas, about his smug confidence, his belief that money and power made him invincible. He thought about the town, their quickness to judge, to condemn. And he realized he couldn't fight this with fists or guns alone. He had to fight it with the truth. But to find the truth, he had to go back to the source. He had to go to Kansas. It was a desperate, insane plan. Leaving the ranch meant leaving it vulnerable. Riding east meant riding into Silas's territory. But leaving Maybelle to rot in a cell, to face a hangman's noose for a crime she didn't commit, was not an option. Before dawn, he was gone. He left a note for Zeke Holloway, asking him to look after the place. He rode hard, pushing his horse, pushing himself, fueled by a cold, righteous fury. The journey was a blur of dust and exhaustion. He arrived in the Kansas town Silas ruled like a king, a stranger in a hostile land. He started asking his own questions, not in the saloon, but in the shadows. He spoke to a stable hand who remembered Maybelle's father, a good man driven to ruin by Silas's predatory loans. He found a former clerk of Silas's, a man who had been fired for knowing too much, who drank to forget the crooked numbers he'd been forced to write in the ledgers. Slowly, piece by agonizing piece, Jed uncovered the truth. Maybelle's father hadn't embezzled anything. Silas had systematically destroyed him, forging documents, creating phantom debts until the man had nothing left. The stolen money was a fiction, a final cruel twist of the knife to ruin the man's name even in death. The marriage contract wasn't just a business transaction. It was the final nail in the coffin, a way for Silas to acquire the last thing of value the Quinn family had left: their daughter. He found his proof in a dusty county records office, in a ledger the drunken clerk had told him about. A hidden ledger detailing Silas's true transactions, filled with his arrogant, looping signature. It was the smoking gun. With the ledger tucked safely in his saddlebags, Jed rode back to Montana, a man possessed. He rode back to save the woman he loved. But as he crossed the border, a chilling piece of news reached him from a passing rider. The circuit judge had arrived in Harmony Creek early. Maybelle's trial was scheduled for the next day. He was out of time. The race against the gallows had begun. He spurred his horse, every muscle screaming, the fate of Mabel, their future, resting on his ability to outrun the hangman. The courtroom in Harmony Creek was just the town hall, packed to the rafters with a morbidly curious crowd. They weren't there for justice. They were there for a spectacle. Maybelle stood before the judge, a traveling magistrate with a weary face and a reputation for harsh sentences. She stood alone, dressed in a simple prison gown, her hands bound, but her head was held high. The prosecutor, a man in Silas's pocket, laid out the fabricated case with practiced ease. He presented the forged documents, the false testimonies from men Silas had paid off. To the town, it looked ironclad. Ruth Dobbins sat in the front row, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. The judge listened, his expression unreadable. "Does the defendant have anything to say?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Maybelle opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, but what could she say against a mountain of lies? "I am not a thief," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing through the silent room. "Silas is the criminal. He is the one who should be on trial," the prosecutor scoffed. Desperate words from a desperate woman. He turned to the judge. "The evidence is clear. We ask for a verdict of guilty, and a sentence that reflects the severity of her crimes." The judge was about to speak, to deliver the verdict that would seal her fate, when the doors at the back of the hall burst open. Jed stood there, covered in dust, his face gaunt with exhaustion but his eyes burning with a righteous fire. He held a leather-bound ledger in his hand. "This trial is a sham," he roared, his voice filling the room. "And I have the proof." He strode down the aisle, the crowd parting before him like the sea. He threw the ledger onto the judge's bench. "This is Silas's real account book. It details every crooked loan, every forged signature, every man he's ruined. It proves Maybelle's father owed him nothing. It proves this whole trial is based on a lie." The prosecutor paled. Silas, who had been watching from the side, a smug look on his face, took an involuntary step back. The judge opened the ledger. He scanned the pages, his weary eyes widening in shock, then hardening with anger. He looked from the ledger to the prosecutor, then to Silas. "Is this true?" he demanded. The prosecutor stammered, speechless. Silas saw the game was up. He turned to flee, but the men of the town, men who had whispered and judged, had seen enough. Zeke Holloway and a dozen other ranchers blocked his path. The tide of public opinion had turned with a violent, sudden crash. The judge slammed his gavel down. "This court is adjourned. The defendant, Maybelle Quinn, is released. All charges are dismissed." He pointed a trembling finger at Silas. "Sheriff, arrest this man. And you," he said, glaring at the prosecutor, "you'll be facing your own trial." The room erupted. Maybelle ran into Jed's arms, sobbing with relief, with exhaustion, with a love so powerful it left them both shaking. The crowd that had come to see her hang now cheered for her, their cheers a thunderous apology. Ruth Dobbins sat frozen in her seat, her face a mixture of shock and dawning shame. She looked at Maybelle, truly looked at her for the first time, and saw not a harlot or a thief, but a woman of incredible courage who had endured the unthinkable. She rose silently and slipped out the back door, unable to face the truth of her own blind judgment. Back at the ranch, as the sun set, painting the Montana sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink, a new kind of peace settled over them. The ghosts of the past, both his and hers, had finally been laid to rest. The whispers of the town had been silenced. All that remained was the quiet, steady truth of their love. Jed took Maybelle's hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. "No more running," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out at the vast open land that was now her home. "No more running," she whispered. "I'm finally home." They had faced down grief, lies, judgment, and a ruthless enemy. They had fought for their life together, and they had won. Their love story, born from a desperate lie and forged in the crucible of scandal and injustice, had become a testament to the enduring power of truth, courage, and finding a home in the heart of another. In the vast, untamed expanse of the Old West, where silence could be a crushing burden, we've seen how the courage to speak the truth can change everything. It's a story about dismantling the walls we build around our hearts and fighting for the life we deserve, even when the whole world stands against us. This tale of resilience and unexpected love reminds us that sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most profound rewards. What walls have you had to break down in your own life? And what truths were waiting on the other side? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story is a valuable part of our community. And if tales of passion, justice, and the untamed human spirit are what you seek, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more journeys into the heart of the wild.